Caroline Lucas, you're now a Green MP. 10 years ago, you were a Green MEP. But what were you doing at the start of the 1990s?
Well, what I had been doing was working as the Green Party's press officer between 87 and 89. I always like to cite the fact that the general election of 1987, the Greens got, I think, around 1.3% of the vote. The European elections, of course, in 1989, we had 15% of the vote. Now, I don't really claim that I can call the credit for that, but it was a really fascinating time to be watching what was happening to green issues generally.
So there was a ferment of ideas at the time, was there?
There really was. I think there was a huge amount of interest and enthusiasm for finding out more about the environment. And one of the things that I remember very clearly was we had seals being washed up on the shores of Britain, presumably because of pollution problems. And that really captured the public imagination. Suddenly, pollution wasn't something invisible. It was something that was affecting very beautiful creatures that were being washed up dead on our shores in all of the newspapers.
But you also had Margaret Thatcher, who put climate change and the environment on the political map. Is that right?
I think she did in her landmark speeches to the Conservative Party, also to the Royal Society. You know, she spoke of the Conservative Party not just being friends of the earth, but being guardians of the earth for the future generations. This was very new language to be hearing from a government of the day. And I think that combination between the kind of credibility that suddenly was being given to the environment by the Prime Minister, plus, as I say, these images of animals being killed through pollution, that catalysed in people's minds to think we need to do something about this. And although Mrs. Thatcher was talking about it, there was very little action being proposed at that point. And I think that's what gave the Green Party the real opportunity to come in there with some very strong messages.
At the same time, the international environment was coming right up the agenda, and that culminated in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. Were you aware of these issues at that time?
Yeah, the Earth Summit really put the environment on the agenda like nothing had before. I mean, the amount of media coverage that conference generated, and I suppose the amount of hope, because it was in the days before we'd all got a bit jaundiced about big international conferences, and I think there was a real hope and expectation that this Rio conference was really going to achieve a lot. Looking back on it, actually, I think it probably did achieve more than we thought in the immediate aftermath. I think after 92, there was a sense of, well, you know, what's changed? It felt like we were back to business as usual to some extent. I think with the benefit of hindsight, you can look back and say, well, that gave birth to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Climate Change Convention, the Forest Principles, the Agenda 21. Lots of the themes that were then going to run through the rest of that decade were really crystallised at that Earth Summit.
Back in 1993, you had Twyford Down and the start of popular protest about the environment. What was going on there?
Well, I think this is really interesting because if you looked at some of the big environmental groups, Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, who'd become much bigger, more professionalised through the 80s, in the early 90s, they began to lose members, lose income. And I think what was happening in a sense was that for some people, they were finding that with that new professionalism, if you like, came a loss of flexibility, of nimbleness, potentially of radicalism. And so at a local level, I think you did see this rise of direct action groups like Earth First and Reclaim the Streets. And what they were doing was absolutely catalysing action on the ground, like, as you say, with Twyford Down.
Did you welcome that, or were you shocked by it? Were you surprised by it?
I think we did welcome it. The Green Party has always believed in the role of peaceful direct action, and I think there was a growing frustration that although the environment as an issue was now firmly on the political agenda, there was nothing like, you know, concomitant action to tackle it. And so while the analysis was growing, and that was great, the action wasn't. So I think peaceful direct action was incredibly important. And what was happening at that time, I think, was really interesting, because when you had a group like Reclaim the Streets, what they said very clearly, sort of mid-90s, was that yes, cars cause pollution in our streets, but capitalism is what's causing even more pollution, and that's more insidious.
Come forward to 1999, you had the epic World Trade Organization conference in Seattle. Everyone knew there was going to be a huge clash of cultures, but you were there. What was it like?
I found that meeting to be very, very interesting. I was there as a member of the European Parliament's Trade Committee, so I was a member of the sort of informal delegation from the European Parliament. And what I found so interesting was that gave me a path, if you like, to be able to get into the inside of the WTO meetings, and could really feel the visceral fear as people were looking out of the windows at fights going on outside, big protests, massively bigger than I think people had been expecting. And there really was fear and concern in the corridors of the WTO meeting, I think. And then to be able to pass and go outside and be part of those demonstrations as well, and get that sense that people really felt that they might just be making a difference.
You'd become a member of the European Parliament in 1999, the first Green MEP. What was changing in Britain that they could vote you in?
Well, I would love to say that it was as a result of a huge change of consciousness and thus the Greens were swept to power. In fact, I think it was because the British government had come under massive pressure to change the electoral system for the European elections. We had been the only country in the EU that was using a system for the European elections that wasn't proportional. And so there had been a ruling that said that all elections to the European Parliament should be using a proportional system. So that's what enabled us to get 2 Greens elected. I mean, it was also, I think, of course, a result of many of the concerns that we've been discussing. People were deeply concerned around GMOs, around our food. They did understand Europe was a key place to be fighting for animal welfare issues, which was also a growing concern, I think, in the 90s, around trade policy as well. Lots of the development NGOs were talking more and more about how trade policy was really destroying the lives of people in poorer countries. So I think there was that upswell of concern at the late 90s, but it was also the case that the electoral system was changed, which enabled us to get those seats.
Was there a sense that Europe would act when Britain wouldn't? In fact, were you setting the agenda in Europe for the environment?
I think exactly that the frustration that people were feeling at a lack of action at the national level was mirrored by at least some hope that at the EU level could help us. And we know, of course, that huge amounts of our environmental legislation, around 90% of it, comes from the EU anyway. Trade policy is negotiated through the EU, animal rights is negotiated at the EU. Actually, I think there was a growing understanding that in order to fight some of these big battles, we needed strong green voices at the European level. And that certainly, I think, helped us in terms of making that case in those elections.
So, Caroline, where was the environmental movement at the end of the 1990s?
I think things were a little bit confused at the end of the 1990s. I think that the anti-globalisation movement was on a bit of a high. I think that we did regard Seattle as a high point, an important success, if you like, in terms of getting our issues on the political agenda at Seattle and indeed in every newspaper and TV screen around the land. So the anti-globalisation movement, I think, was growing strongly. I think the environment groups were still struggling a little bit with making that new link with some of the direct action groups, with the economic analysis that was now having to increasingly inform their environmental analysis. So that was all happening, but perhaps it hadn't created a real kind of fruition at that point. It was later in the 2000s before that happened.